It's not easy playing green, having to draw each card in whatever order it is in, when I think it could be nicer being red or blue or black, having card selection like that. It's not easy playing green, seems you can remove even ordinary things. Their bomb just runs you over, 'cause you're just curving out and hoping you've got the bigger guy. But green is the color of ramp, and green can be mid-range and toolbox-like, and green can be fast like aggro, or slow like control, or even go 0-3. When green is all there is to play, it could make you wonder why. But why wonder why? I'm green and it'll do fine. And even if I lose, I think it's what I want to be. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony Hair Shirt Maddox. No, Horse Shirt. You said Horse Shirt. I was supposed to call you Horse Shirt. You didn't say Hair Shirt. I have one, little tiny misspeak on the podcast, and I am still living down bird walks, like 5 years later. And I was trying to make fun of you for calling a hair shirt a horse shirt, and I also missaid it, so I guess I lose.
Yep, you lose. That was my long con, and I got you.
I bet a horse shirt would also be uncomfortable.
Yeah. Isn't a hair shirt made of horse hair? Can it be? I don't know.
I think it's just a famously uncomfortable shirt. Probably has some, I don't know, it's got some historical ramifications.
Yeah, you wear it if you're
implications.
one of those, if you're a certain type of religion that you think you need to punish yourself and suffer in order to,
Right, but you thought it was a horse shirt, dummy.
Yeah, I'm so dumb. Also, bird walks, real thing, which, it's spring here in Baltimore, and I saw a flock the other day of Parker's favorite bird, which we all know is a cedar waxwing.
He do love a cedar waxwing.
Really,
I think he partially likes it
bird.
because it's a really good name.
Good name, great looking bird, really no notes.
If it had a stupid name, I don't think he would like it as much, but cedar waxwing is like a cellar door.
Cedar
the cellar
waxwing.
door of bird species. Are all the things different species of birds? Is that the right word?
Are all the things different species of birds?
Well, is your list of birds a list of bird species you've seen, or do you keep track of...
Oh, like if you have a life
varieties
list?
Within species.
There are certain varieties within species.
Because
sure.
Dogs are all the same species, but they all look way different. Is that the same thing in birds? Whereas a million different looking birds that are actually all just the same species of bird, and it just depends on, I don't know.
It's not as extreme. Dogs are a very extreme example of
variety
we got
within one species. With it.
Yeah, more often it's a male and female or a adult versus a juvenile of one bird species can look pretty different.
Mm-hmm.
And there's regional variations. I think that here we have the most beautiful dark-eyed juncos, for example.
That's your favorite bird as far as I know. Is anything replaced the dark-eyed junco?
The cedar waxwings are close.
You're not one for superlatives, I feel.
I'm really not, except I love those little guys.
We are coming back to follow up on our episode from a few weeks back where we talked about Young Pyromancer for over an hour. We expected maybe that episode would be an exchange where the first half of the episode would be me talking about how to play with Young Pyromancer. The second half of the episode would be you talking to me about how to play with curve out green decks. And then it turns out we talked about Young Pyromancer for way too long. So here is the follow-up episode where you teach me how to play curve out green decks. For those that are just tuning in, Anthony and I are both, I think, fairly capable and definitely experienced. Whether we're good or not, who knows? But we've definitely played a lot of cubes. And we tend to have success with different types of decks in general. I tend to like to play young Pyromancer style decks. It's one of the archetypes I like to play and have success with. And I notoriously, every time I draft like a base green whatever deck in any cube, doesn't matter the theme, the power level, the whatever, I just feel like I have no agency in the games and it's just completely up to whether I draw the right cards in the right order. And you have tons of success with these decks. And so here we're flipping the script and you're going to tell me how to get better playing green decks.
You say that, but I feel the imposter syndrome. I mean, it's not imposter syndrome if you're actually an imposter. It's just off the charts here because I don't feel qualified to be able to tell you how to play a
you
card
are
out
the
green.
seventh winningest player in all the history of all cube events.
I know.
You're not an imposter.
7. There are 6 people one more than me. I also, so a nice thing about the way that we interact with Cube is we'll very often, well, every time after we do a Cube draft, we'll post it into our Discord server where we have a separate channel for every unique cube, post our record and deck pick, so it made it easy to go back and review, like, what are the things that I'm actually 3-0ing with? I think I win a lot more with red-white than I realized, and occasionally will win with green.
Okay, well, I'm also good at winning with red-white, so that's not a good episode.
Okay, so we'll get rid of that. And often the green decks that I have 3-0'd with are not like green in a very traditional sense. Like I'm not winning with green ramp decks pretty much ever. And I'm also not winning with decks that are like super heavy focused green decks. A lot of them are like green with sometimes multiple heavy other splashes. So like here's an example of a deck, and we'll put all of the decks like we did for the previous episode that we discuss in the cards mentioned page so you can follow along with more details. But yeah, I feel like one of the things about green is it's a color that has some very big gaps in its ability. So it's difficult to necessarily draft a deck that is just all about doing the green thing, and often you want to pair it with other colors to support and fill in some of those gaps.
I don't think green means mono green. I guess it's actually the most important part. I would describe the decks that I fail to succeed at as quintessential mid-range decks.
Sure, yeah.
And what I find is a lot of tension in drafting these decks between having kind of a more ambiguous game plan. And we've done an ABCs of mid-range episode, and in that episode we talked about what I think made a successful mid-range deck, which is definitely context-dependent. Obviously, it matters a lot what kind of cube you're drafting and what kind of player you are. I think the strength of mid-range, in theory, in the abstract, is that it should be able to play the control side against an aggro deck and play the aggressive side against a control deck. It should be a little more flexible and able to play sort of both sides of that coin. And so the lack of a like hyper-focused plan, like if I'm drafting an aggro deck, I feel perfectly capable of drafting a good aggro deck in most cubes. I feel like it's pretty easy for me to like prioritize things in the right order. Like I want to be able to curve out, which means having a bunch of cheap creatures or cheap threats. It means having good mana. So if I'm playing 2 colors, I want a ton of fixing, or I want to play 1 color or 1 color with a splash. I know that I want to prioritize interaction that can clear blockers and not interaction that, requires my opponent's things to be attacking. I know I want to prioritize things that I can use on my turn at sorcery speed. I don't really care about instant speed interaction over sorcery speed interaction in my aggro decks because I hope to be tapped out on my opponent's turn all the time because I hope to have spent my mana presenting threats. So I have a bunch of heuristics for like doing that. When I'm playing a control deck, it's like, okay, I want to drag the game out as long as possible. I want to have answers to all of the threats my opponents present, and then I want to generate some form of card advantage, literal or virtual, to overwhelm my opponent and then have any old win condition. All the details matter, depending on context, but those two are places I feel like I can thrive because I have a very clear focus. It's like, no matter what, I want to go slower and control, or no matter what, I want to go faster and beat down. I always have this tension when I'm drafting these, what I would describe as mid-range decks, and maybe you would not describe them as mid-range decks, and that's a valuable conversation to have. I find this tension of like, well, I want to have threats, but I can't just have threats. A mistake I've made before is essentially end up drafting a mid-range deck that doesn't really have any interaction. I get to the end of the draft and I'm like, okay, well, I took what I thought was like the best card at every sort of spot, and now I just actually have no interaction. So like, I was playing against Patrick, and I actually forget what cube, and he played the stupid, we talked about this on air, the stupid 3-1 that makes it, or I actually don't know what his power and toughness is. The thing that makes a 3-1 for every aura and equipment attached to it, Valda, Keeper of the Flame. And it's like, well, that card dies to a stiff wind and requires all this setup, but if uninteracted with, will single-handedly go over my whole deck's synergistic, whatever, like just completely overwhelm all of my threats. So anyway, I draft a deck where it ends up having too many threats and not enough answers, or the other way around, where I end up drafting a deck where it's like, okay, well, now I have a bunch of answers, but I don't have those sort of control deck marquee cards of like being able to generate a bunch of card advantage, virtual or literal, and like then come back from behind. And so I end up like 1-for-1ing my opponent, and then if they're aggressive, they just maybe actually win the aggressive matchups, possibly. These decks are not all bad, but if they're controlling deck, then I just get absolutely smoked because it's like, well, I have too much removal in my deck now, and you're playing control, and so I always feel like I have the wrong tools all the time, no matter what I do.
Interesting. I mean, it's such a funny, like, things that seem very different end up being sort of similar in a weird wraparound kind of way, because you're describing a control deck has a very specific plan. It's like, my plan is to win the game with inevitability. Like, I will eventually beat you with my Young Pyromancer and 2 random 1/1s, because I know I have enough removal to just deal with everything that you're going to do. On the other hand, that's also describing like a totally reactive game plan where it's like, what are you going to do in this game? I don't know. It depends what my opponent's going to do. And I will react to them with my counter spells or my removal spells. You know, similar with the aggro deck having a very specific plan. And these kinds of mid-range decks, I feel like in some ways they do have a plan. Like the plan is I'm going to attack you as much as possible until I can't. And then I'm going to figure out what my plan B is. So it feels like they are like dumber decks, or like they are not the ones that are there trying to figure out what your opponent is doing and figure out how to prevent that as much as possible. I don't know. Does that make any sense how these things seem different and yet they are maybe the same?
I mean, that's the nuance I think I'm struggling with.
Yeah, it's like playing the mid-range deck. You do have to be extremely responsive to figuring out, am I the beatdown right now?
Well, but here's the thing. I don't know how good I am at doing that in the moment in a game. I feel like I'm thinking about that. And what I find often I feel is like, I've identified this as a matchup or a moment where I should be the beatdown. Mm-hmm. Oops, I drew the removal spell half of my deck because my deck also has to have that. And so I don't have the ability to shift my plan, even though I've identified as a player that I need to, which I think is that sort of experience I've described of just feeling like I drew my cards in the wrong order, right? Which is what I find so much in these decks where it's like, okay, if I had drawn my aggressive start here, I do have curve out creatures, I do have a curve. If I had drawn that, it would have been great. But instead I drew 1 threat, a ramp spell, and 2 removal spells. And now my control opponent is just laughing at me and end step factor fictioning, and I'm just like falling way behind. Or the vice versa is true, where it's like I draw like a curve out against a deck that just has a little bit of removal and then put some threat in play, like a stupid Valduk or a Young Pyromancer or whatever. I'm like, well, I don't have one of my 6 removal spells in my deck, so I can't deal with that. And so I guess I just get completely overwhelmed.
Yeah, okay. So I think that that's kind of the first couple questions of building this kind of mid-range deck is just building the deck and drafting. And I think that there's a couple heuristics that I don't know if I have the right answer, but I think I know what the questions we have to ask are, which is like, what does my curve look like? And what is the density of the things that I'm doing that are not necessarily just threats? So this is removal spells. Maybe you have some hand hate. Maybe you have equipments and other kind of like stuff that's maybe going to affect the board in other ways. And figuring out like what are those proportions and what does that mana curve look like is really the first step to success. Because I think that when you're talking about building a control deck, yeah, you have Brainstorm, you have Ponder, you have Preordain. You're going to have all this hand smoothing that gives you a lot more like safety and flexibility.
I feel so good.
And you don't necessarily have that if you're drafting your green mid-range deck. Like you do just need to have your cards show up in the right order. And so drafting a curve where you're reliably going to have a 2-drop and a 3-drop in your opening hand is so much of the game. And I think, you know, for me, as we talked about in the previous episode, I think mulligans are really important there as well. And these are the mulligans that I really struggle with, where it's not just like, oh, I have 7 lands, so sure, like I'll throw that away. But like, ooh, I don't have a 3-drop. Like, can I actually win this matchup without having a 3-drop? I don't know. And like throwing away a hand that is somewhat functional but isn't necessarily like executing that plan is a difficult decision.
Mulligans could be a huge part of my problem here, because people listening to this might be screaming like, if you know you're playing the control deck, don't keep a hand with 2 removal spells and a ramp spell or whatever. I think I am way more hesitant to mulligan. Well, not way more. I think I'm marginally more hesitant to mulligan with these decks given the relative lack of card selection, because it feels like I'm not going to have a ton of control over the cards that I'm drawing as the game progresses. And so it feels like I want to have as many pieces of material, as many game objects in my hand to work with at the start, so that I have more things to choose from to basically execute my game plan. And obviously, like, you know, I hope it's clear that I would mulligan, you know, against the known control player, 3 lands, 3 removal spells, and like an abundant growth. Like, yeah, I'm going to mulligan that against the control deck. Ideally, I'd want to sideboard out of some of the bad, you know, removal spells if I could in that matchup. But yeah, I think I'm more likely to be like, okay, well, I think I'm supposed to keep this hand because I do have, you know, 3 lands, 2 threats, and like, you know, a couple things that seem like they would buy some time or whatever. And maybe mulligans is a huge hole for me.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean,
just give me the answer. How many removal spells do you want in a deck like this?
4?
That's it?
4 to 2?
Whoa. This is great. I'm glad I asked a direct question because it's way fewer than I expected.
Yeah, I mean, so there's another kind of parallel that I was trying to think about, like, how do I make a deck like this that is functional? First of all, I feel like the ones that I have success with are maybe a little bit more on the aggressive side than purely mid-range. It's not like I am 50-50. Sometimes I'm going to be on the, like, defense. Sometimes I'm going to be on the attack. Like, I want to be starting the game quick, and I want to be attacking as fast as possible. Like,
you expect to be asking questions of your opponent.
Exactly. And this is
when
something
you sit
that,
down turn 0.
Yeah, when I think Justin Parnell phrased it this way, where you were like, well, don't you really want this aggressive spell in your rotisserie deck? And he's like, this reactive spell. And he's like, well, I could play that, but sometimes it's better just to be the one asking the questions than answering them. And I think that is a big part of why maybe I play fewer removal spells often, because I just want to get a threat in play, and what I want to be using the removal spells for is not necessarily just being able to have an answer for everything that my opponent is doing, but using it to optimize the way that I can use my threats. And there's a couple ways that a removal spell can be used. Obviously, there's I'm going to die to this flyer, so I just want to end the game, but that's not really plan A. Like, I don't want to be in the situation where I'm using a removal spell to prevent me from losing. I'd rather be using the removal spells to do things that are proactive, and especially if I can use them to generate card advantage. So you said you don't really value instant speed as much in an aggressive deck, but instant speed removal can be so valuable to be able to take control of a combat step, especially if your opponent is in a situation where they have to double block, or if your opponent is using their own instant speed effects to be able to use a combat trick. Having instant speed removal that can allow you to just go into combat confidently is an extremely powerful position to be in. I also feel like there's this parallel. You talked about how, I think you said this, that the blue deck often has fewer counterspells than you think they do. It just kind of feels that way often, that it's like, yeah, you have the counterspell. And I think with something like combat tricks, it can be very similar, where it's like, yep, I know my opponent is going to have the combat trick, so like, here it is. It's so frustrating that they always seem to have it. And it's like, yeah, but maybe they just had the one combat trick, and you correctly read that they had it because of the way that they attacked, and then you chose not to block 3 turns because you correctly read they had the combat trick, and then when you decided, oh, I guess I can't really afford to go to 4 here, so I'll double block, and then they finally use the combat trick, it's like, well, you allowed yourself to feel like they always have it 3 turns when really they just had the one.
That's not something I suffer from. I always in the make 'em have it camp on combat tricks personally. I know some players do play that way, and it's probably correct too in some situations, but my frustration, let's not make this another sort of battle in the combat trick proxy war. I think your point is well taken. To the point of like the density of interactive spells, I feel like I don't want to draw more than 1 or 2 in most games, because I only want to use those removal spells on a thing that my deck can't otherwise beat. Like, I just want to use them on their silver bullet answer, or their like huge, bomb they invest a bunch of resources into or something. I don't want to be just removing things as a matter of course, which is to some degree what a control deck will do, though obviously there's a lot of nuance in determining when and where to use removal spells when you're a control deck. You don't just point them at the first legal target every single time.
Yeah, because I think that you can use your threats as removal in a way. It's like, I'm going to play my 2-mana 2/2. If you want to play your own 2-mana 2/2 and block with it, like, that's fine. And maybe that's an interesting question about...
I see that so much from newer players. Our Cube Knight is great, wide variety of investment in our play group. And from newer Cube players, I see all the time, like, well, I've got my 2/1 that I put in my deck to attack you and deal damage, but now you have a Dark Confidant. And it's like, yeah, you just attack. You're willing to trade that with a Dark Confidant. That's fine, or whatever. That's an important point, and I think it's also important to me that you can only be in that position if you are, as you said, more aggressive than maybe I'm imagining I have to be. Like, you can't just not pressure your opponent's life total for the first 3 turns and then expect to be forcing blocks, on turn 4.
Yes,
because they won't. They'll just be like, all right, fine, well, now I'll take some damage. Who cares? And then they can afford to like take their time and build up a bigger, more synergistic engine than you have going on.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, that like your opponent's life total is a resource. Make them use it. And there is a big shift in the game. I feel like in the mid game of a game of Magic, you're often just sort of using heuristics in order to gain the most value. Like, your opponent's life total doesn't really matter yet, because you just want to generate card advantage to get ahead, or you want to be able to get more on the board and be able to put pressure on your opponent. And then at some point, the game shifts, and it's like, okay, well, now my opponent's life total is low enough that if I attack with everything, I'm now threatening lethal, and they have to start making blocks that are worse for them. And the sooner...
Or what I find sometimes, too, is like, if I attack with everything now, I'm going to have like pretty clearly lethal in like a turn or 2. Like, my clock is really fast, so it's like, well, now they have to play around the fact that I might have a burn spell. They have to play around the fact that like I've got this 2-powered flyer, and if they don't block here and use their life total as a resource, then they're on a 2-turn clock from this flyer they may not have a removal spell for. So it's not always like, strictly speaking, they're dead if they don't block, but it's like they're effectively in an awful spot if they don't block, and dead to a lot of top decks, or dead in the very near future.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that when you feel that game shift, and it's like, okay, now I'm like generating this card advantage not by casting a divination, but I'm generating card advantage by they had to chump block with their young pyromancer. That feels great.
I bet that does feel good.
Want to get into that situation. So I think another heuristic that I follow in these types of decks
is young pyromancer. Haha, it wasn't a chump block at all.
Always deploying things that put the most pressure on your opponent before you do anything else. So it's like, maybe I do have a card like divination, or I have some other thing that's going to generate value over time. I'm not casting that on turn 3. Like, I'm waiting to do that after I've done as much as I can to just keep putting pressure on my opponent as much as possible.
And it sounds like that would trump mana efficiency. So let's say theoretically you've got, a handful of 2-drops, you play a 2-drop on turn 2, but you also have a divination in hand. You're probably, again, this is all context dependent, but you're saying you're probably playing another 2-drop on turn 3, not the divination yet.
Yes, I think that, those are two heuristics that are both like, if that was your only principle, would serve you okay. Like, be mana efficient is a good rule. Put as much pressure on your opponent or develop your board state as quickly as possible is also a good rule. Those will sometimes conflict, and you have to sort of be able to suss it out. And I think that's where having just a lot of flexibility, sure, I'd rather just be able to cast a bunch of 3-drop into 3-drop into 3-drop because it is more pound for pound stuff that my cards do, but it's actually really useful to have this 1-mana spell to be able to fill that in so I can actually optimize these multiple heuristics. And sometimes that also means I'm just going to second main phase cast my Bone Splitter for no value. I'm not going to equip it right away just because I wanted to keep up mana during combat and then I wanted to cast another creature. So yeah, you end up having to sacrifice on one of your heuristics very often.
Do you have a gut feeling heuristically how you feel about making trades in the early game? I'm just thinking, okay, I've got a hand that's got my 2-drop threats and my divination, and I play my first 2-drop, and on turn 3 I attack with it, and my opponent trades with a creature that I feel like is roughly equal value, right? This is not a, trading a Savannah Lions for a Dark Confidant situation.
Right.
They're trading for roughly equal value in my mind. Does that make you less excited to play that second 2-drop now that you actually haven't dealt much damage and your opponent has traded off and now it's going to be your only thing on board and now maybe you're considering mana efficiency? Or do you think in general you're still I want to be on the gas at this stage of the game as a base green mid-rangey deck?
Yeah, I think that in general I still want to be putting the pressure on it. If we have traded and we're on an empty board, great. Put my other bear out there. Let's keep this going. Yeah, use the divination when you're at turn 5 and suddenly you have nothing else to do and you need a way to recoup and get back in the game. I think that that's also an interesting question about when to use combat tricks and when to be willing to trade for something, because I think that there is this sort of level 1 of I'm going to attack my 2/2 into your 2/2. You're going to think, well, I don't want to block because you might have a combat trick. And then the next level is, oh, well, I will block because if you use your combat trick, then we're still just trading 1 for 1. You've saved your creature, you've killed my creature. I think very often then the next level is, well, actually, I'll just let our creatures trade because I don't want to use this combat trick to be able to trade my 2/2 for your 2/2. I want to save this combat trick for a couple turns where suddenly you have a 5/5 in play, and now I don't have any other way to deal with that, but I can use this combat trick to actually generate an advantage that I wouldn't otherwise be able to. Or ideally, I want to use this combat trick to fade a removal spell or punish a double block. Because yeah, it's trading your combat trick for just one other creature is often not that meaningful unless that creature. And yeah, there's endless exceptions to when am I not going to do this. Maybe I have Overrun in my deck, I really just want to make my board state as big as possible. But
and post all those exceptions in the comments. Let's bait engagement. For sure. Yeah, I'm always with combat tricks or combat trick style cards. Doing the translation in my head of okay, well, 2/2 into 2/2 they block. Do I want to turn this card into 1 mana, tap an untapped creature you control during your first main phase, remove target creature your opponent controls? Is that what I really want this card to be doing? And the answer is usually no, because the ceiling on those cards tends to be way higher. It tends to be okay, well, now it's a 3 damage to your opponent's face in a race where they left a couple unblocked attackers, or now it is a massive 2 for 1 because they double blocked because they had to, and then you get to blow them out. So I'm always doing that translation of what am I actually getting for my mana and card out of this situational sort of contextual combat trick.
Yeah, and I think that's reasonable to go into combat, make an attack, and then decide, actually, you know what, those blocks are fine. You want to feel clever and have the combat trick, but yeah, if you can get more value out of it down the road, then often that's pretty reasonable. Combat is just such an important part of drafting this kind of proactive mid-range deck, and being able to pay attention to what's happening in combat and sculpt the board state so that you're always feeling like you can put that pressure on. So when you're looking at a board state, obviously you're not evaluating, are you able to attack here from first principles every turn? You're building off of what's happened from the previous turn. So you're thinking, okay, last turn I was able to attack. Now they've played a 4/4. Does that affect things? And I feel like I should be able to break this down more easily, but there's sort of a set of, I don't know, bracketing questions that I ask when you're trying to figure out, can you actually attack? And it's okay, well, if I attack all, what's the worst thing that happens to me? Well, I have a 3/3, you have a 4/4, so I'm just losing my best creature. If I do that over the course of a few turns and I'm continually losing my best creature, is that a great state for me? Not really. And especially if you're in the mid game where you're still on the heuristics of how am I generating value, just jump attacking into a bigger creature that you're just going to lose is not a great plan. But then again, once you hit that shift of oh, I'm attacking you, and even if you kill my biggest thing, you're taking a huge chunk of your life total out. Now you're going to have to start using things in a suboptimal way.
How much do you feel like you bluff with these decks?
I think a reasonable amount, but I think more
and
often...
just to be clear for the listener, I'm talking like,
Yeah.
let's say I have some high-value creature, like, let's call it Tal'Ren Sky Summoner, right? 2/2.
Yeah.
And you attack with a 1/1 or something, where you have a couple attacks, one of them is a 1/1, on board, an apparent free, well, I just get to eat that creature with my 2/2, but I risk you having a pump spell, a -1/-1 spell, something that will actually then remove my big threat. I feel like that's a calculus I'm always doing on the other side. I'm usually playing the other side of the battlefield.
Right.
I usually have the tolerant or whatever, and I'm like, is it worth, 1 life right now to take this risk? And in this exact example I've manufactured on the fly, probably just take a damage is my general assessment, because that 1 damage is less likely to have a huge swing on the game than somehow losing my engine that is going to spit out a bunch of 2/2s over the next couple turns. I feel like I'm always making that assessment from the other side. I don't feel like I'm often in positions where I feel like I can threaten a bluff or throw an attack where I feel like I'm hoping they just are afraid of something and don't block. Do you feel like that happens a lot to you when you're navigating these decks?
I wouldn't say that bluffing is the norm, but it's definitely a thing you can do. And I think that if you're never bluffing, you're not bluffing enough. And I think it's also kind of a spectrum. I guess when I think about it, it's like, okay, you have a high value creature and I have a high value creature. If I choose not to attack and then I choose not to block, that's a situation that I'm really going to scrutinize for myself. And I'm going to be like, okay, I didn't attack with this creature. I didn't block with this creature. Yeah. What is your job? And I think if both players are in that position, one of them is wrong, right? We don't necessarily know who, but somebody should have been attacking there.
In my case, probably me.
Yeah, and so I think that there's a spectrum of okay, well, I should just be attacking because even if you just trade here, this is actually kind of reasonable. And then there's the pure bluff of just, I'm attacking my 2/2 into your 3/3. I'm telling you I have a combat trick.
There's no other things on board or whatever. Your life total is 16.
Yeah. And there are some cases, again, I think this is a huge spectrum, because there are some cases where, the block is just so punishing that, of course, they're not going to do it. You're playing your control deck, you've cast your Talrend, and you have a handful of cheap cantrips. Of course, you're not blocking my 1/1. That's basically a free attack. Do you want to then be sending your opponent the signal that you have a combat trick, or that you're trying to imply that? Maybe not, but
what if it's a high value one creature, though?
What's the best 1/1?
Mother of Runes.
Ooh, no, I'm not doing that.
Actually, at Friday Morning Magic the other week, I've had some really interesting games at Friday Morning Magic recently. A match I had with Allison is actually coming to mind a lot in these conversations, where Allison, maybe I'll talk more about those games, but I had a game where my opponent, I think, lost the game because they should have been attacking with Mother of Runes and were not, because their heuristic was just, well, I never attack. You don't attack with this card. And they just knew it was game 3 of a match, and I was playing a deck that had very little interaction, and they had seen one of my 2 removal spells already in the game, and they were just holding up Mother of Runes, and I was like, I think you're just supposed to attack me with this. I have no blockers, and it's 1 more damage over the next 3 turns, and I think it ended up making the difference in the game. So every heuristic always has a reason to ignore it, and a time you're supposed to abandon it. I want to be really clear too, we're talking a lot about combat tricks as a shorthand for these kinds of cards. I think a cube can have nothing that you might listening identify as a combat trick, and these things all still apply, right? Disfigure after combat or in combat, or even a sorcery speed 1 damage to a target after blocks can then mean that this thing that blocked now dies, even though it wasn't going to die on board.
Right.
Which is part of the reason, again, not to make this a combat trick proxy war, but I think some of the attitudes of the pro combat trick community are well, combat doesn't matter if you don't have combat tricks. And I'm like, yes, it does.
Oh, for sure.
I have all these removal spells and damage spells and instant speed, things that change toughness and instant speed. The difference is that they all also do something on their own. They all have a base rate of just being able to remove a threat or do something. Whereas I think the canonical combat trick does nothing if you have no creature in play. And
right.
That's the main difference. But either way.
And I think the best place to be in as the person who is on the attack is to have it both. Have everything you need.
Yes, really have it all.
Ideally, if you have both, here's my giant growth, and also here's my lava dart, I'm going to attack into your high value creature, and if you block, great, I can giant growth it. If you don't block, whatever, doesn't matter. If you do block, I have my lava dart, and I can actually just finish off the threat. And by putting yourself in the situation where you're asking your opponent to make that choice and call your bluff or not, oftentimes your opponent just doesn't block, and then you save the lava dart for something else in the future. And that's the ideal situation when you're like, okay.
Yeah, for double triggering your own pyromancer.
Yeah, or
at instant speed.
I'm going to attack my 2/2 into your 2/2, you don't block, and then second main phase, I'm going to play a 3/3. It's I just got everything out of this exchange, and you probably should have blocked because you didn't know a 3/3 was coming.
I have a couple other questions.
Okay.
Which are spots I find myself in, and they're mostly draft and deck building related, because we've talked a lot about gameplay and sequencing patterns. I actually don't think that's my big problem. Again, I'm sure I'm not playing perfectly. I'm sure I'm making tons of mistakes in these games, but I am thinking about all the things we've already talked about. Like, it's not like any of these things are revelatory for me. These are all thoughts that are like in my head. And the feeling I'm having is like my deck is just not showing up for me, right? And that means that I think I'm failing somewhere higher upstream. One tension I often have in drafting is a tension between, with these decks specifically, I feel like this question is easier for me to answer with a different macro archetype in mind. A tension I often feel is a pack where I have a choice between an on-curve, call it a B, a 2-drop that's like fine, or a 4-drop that feels like a huge bomb. In the aggro deck, I'm like, give me the 2-drop. I have a strategy here, and like it's a plan that I have. And so like, unless, obviously there's, if we're talking about a D- 2-drop and an A++ 4-drop, I'm taking the 4-drop, but my sort of tendency tends to be towards prioritizing curve more than card quality in an aggro deck. I feel like these decks often have this problem of like, I don't know what's more important to me. I don't know whether my curve is more important or whether having card quality is more important. And I feel like I make wrong decisions in a lot of those spots when I go either way. Can you enlighten me at all on this nuance?
I can reflect that understanding sort of like what is rate and just having good card evaluation skills is a really important part to this, because like if your opponent is doing something where they just have like all the removal spells, they have all the counter spells, they can deal with anything, or like have ways to generate a bunch of card advantage, and you're just hoping to cast a single spell every turn and hope that's enough, your cards just need to do more. And I think the space about like how do you balance curve versus raw power that's like the whole game. I don't know that there's like an easy heuristic to that, because
I don't think there is a heuristic, obviously, because I think the context matters so much. I think what I'm saying is
you don't like taking the big fancy fun 4-drop.
Well, I don't, generally speaking, like because again, I find when I often draft those decks, I am playing one spell a turn, and then my opponent's just like, haha, unsummon. And I'm like, great, awesome, cool. I wish I was the one casting unsummon and then a cantrip and then another creature. Like, that's what I want to be doing. I always want to be taking multiple game actions. I've also been in the situation where like, okay, fine, I'm taking the 2-drop. I'm going to prioritize my curve. And then my opponents are just like playing haymakers after haymakers, like, turn 4, 5, 6, they're just playing one giant threat after another, and I can't beat them. Like, I know this is the classic, like, when you don't know what you don't know. I feel like I'm losing no matter what I do, and my opponents are winning no matter what they do in some situations. And I'm exaggerating a little bit for the purposes of this show. Like, I was just looking through all my deck lists in the Discord, which you can, if you do have a playgroup Discord, you can search for messages from you that have an image, which is really nice, because in this Discord, that's 95% of what I'm posting. And, my record with green is, it's definitely not as good as my record with blue or my record with, aggro decks, but it's fine. I have some 2-1s and, a couple 3-0s, but also, like, I can't remember the last time I 0-2'd or 0-3'd with a blue deck. Like, it just doesn't happen. I tend to 1-2 or 2-1 or, at least. But green decks are where I'll really fall flat on my face sometimes. Either way, so I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit, but I often feel like I just don't know what to think about in that spot. Like, the question about removal was enlightening. You said you want 2 to 4 removal spells, which is many fewer than I would have guessed.
I mean, I should look at some more decks, but like, yeah, here's a deck that I enjoyed, and I've got 3 of them. I mean, it's great also if your removal spells are also threats.
That's universally true.
Trumpeting Carnosaur, that's a cool flexible card. Fury, I liked casting that one. That one was good.
I do know to draft Fury. I know that much.
One specific cube that I've had that issue in multiple times is the local cube Red Terror, where there's just a lot of power focused on the more expensive cards. So I always end up in a situation where I'm like, okay, I really want to prioritize the 2-drops because I know there are just fewer of them. Like, this is just a pretty high curving cube. And then I'm like, great, I've got all my cool 2-drops. I'm gonna just outpace my opponents. And then they just start casting 4-drop after 4-drop. And understanding, like, is there actually enough of a density of the cheap effects here that I can put pressure on my opponent before they are in that position of just casting a bunch of much more powerful cards at more expensive mana cost? And it's easy to misevaluate that and end up with something that's not as functional.
Maybe a way to reword that. You're saying in that spot where I'm considering on-curve, on-rate creature versus a higher mana value, but by my assessment, above rate, like a better card on average, even at that mana value. You're saying I should be thinking about rate. Okay, what else should be on my mind in that decision? Like, obviously, we're saying there's not a heuristic, there's not a rule of thumb where you always do this or always do that, but like, what are you weighing when you're like looking at that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's what's the like overall just power level, how much impact does this card have? You could also think about that card in terms of how does this function in different states of the game? Like, if I'm just being overrun, does this card also
Quadrant
make
theory.
a bunch of tokens that I can block with? Or does it have evasion so that if I'm losing a race, I can sort of like crawl back or close out a game that I otherwise, the board has just gotten stalled out? Or are there like synergistic elements? What do I already have in my deck? Do I have like a little bit of ramp maybe that can get me to that 4-drop a little bit faster?
Synergy is another spot where I was going to ask basically the same question, but about synergy, because I find this is obviously even more so than everything else we've already mentioned caveats for, massively cube dependent.
Yes.
I mean, the amount that synergy matters is very much depending on the environment you're in. But I mentioned, a few weeks ago on the show that deck that was my spider spawning deck that I absolutely train wrecked with. And it was because, well, I'm not sure exactly why it was, but one of the things I think it was because I kept prioritizing things that like worked with spider spawning and did not really think about how many removal spells I want. Like I was like, ooh, another self-mill card. Like, ooh, another, cheap creature that I can trade with and trades really well in combat, and then will like fill up my graveyard for spider spawning because I expect it to die. Like I kept thinking about my synergistic engine and then got into the games and just lost to not being able to interact with my opponent at all meaningfully. So if you were to like now bring the idea of synergy into this mix, do you expect these decks to be pound for pound, again, relative to the environment they're in, on the more or less synergistic side of the spectrum?
Yeah. I mean, that's when it gets, I think, really fun and interesting. The whole joy of drafting is like looking at a card and saying, okay, this card is whatever. It's a B-. That's its rate in a vacuum. But then it also has a floor and a ceiling. Like it can really underperform if there's a certain situation happening. It can really overperform if there's a certain context for it. And feeling as the draft goes, like, okay, here's my card that it's not just a B-. It's like this whisker plot. It's this, what's its expected floor and ceiling. And slowly, as I'm drafting more things that have +1/+1 counters, my thing that says, whenever you get a +1/+1 counter, you get a little bit of an extra bonus from it. You get a little bit of extra value. I find a lot of joy. I mean, this is kind of like how I intentionally design cubes, and so maybe there's a reason I draft decks like this as well, where it's like, yeah, I'm not necessarily all in a +1/+1 counter deck, but I know this 2-mana 2/2 that this Winding Constrictor just has enough extra stuff to key off of that I think now this is above rate. And finding those
Winding
moments.
Constrictor's a 2/3.
I chose Winding Constrictor after I said 2/2 because
okay, sorry.
But thank you. Yes, it is. Yeah, I mean, I think that is the thing that is the most context dependent, but I think that's also the thing that I get a lot of joy out of. And looking at some of these decks that I've had success with, there often are like, okay, here's my little side quest. It's like, here's the Insidious Roots in my companion cube deck, and this isn't really like an all-in Insidious Roots deck, but like I have enough stuff that interacts with the graveyard in ways that I think that the expected rate of this is still pretty good.
I feel like I'm picking through your responses to try and find the actionable advice. What I'm hearing is, this is what I have a lot of fun doing. It's really joyful for me to navigate this and know how to do this really well. And I'm like, okay.
Well, no, but here's maybe another caveat.
What I'm hearing there is that synergy is more of a side quest for you, and you don't think of your deck as being like, here is my synergistic deck that happens to be like a mid-rangey, mid-curve, green deck. You are thinking about that as, at best, a like side dish to having a good curve, reasonable threats, a decent density of removal. Like, that is more important to you than pursuing some synergy. Again, context dependent.
Right. I mean, I think it's more like, it just sort of depends on what the cube offers, because some synergistic type strategies are just going to be so all in and so supported. Like in the regular cube, you could draft a really, really synergistic red-blue spells deck, and it's just like, all of my threats care about casting spells, and that works. And anything you have that isn't about casting spells is just making your deck worse. It's like this random artifact that doesn't, it's like maybe powerful, but doesn't interact with that synergy, isn't going to contribute to your win percentage.
Maze Mind Tome.
Yeah, perfect example. I think that green mid-rangey creature-based strategies just tend not to be supported in the same way in a lot of cubes. So I'm not necessarily saying, oh yeah, here's another thing that cares about +1/+1 counters. I want this above everything. It's still like, okay, does this synergistic card actually pick up the lower end of the whisker charts of all of my cards enough that makes it worthwhile? Or do I just want something that is just better rate in its average case?
I'm trying to figure out if the gaps in my knowledge are mostly not knowing what a good deck looks like, or not knowing how to get there through a draft. And I think it's actually more the former. Like, again, it sounds like maybe on average I'm running too much removal in these decks. Or, I think we can probably both agree that, like, I'm always taking removal that is also a threat. Like, you said that in that.
Sure, yeah.
Like that is, like, free, just, great card. But I'm talking about the decision of, like, do I want my first Doomblade or my, like, second really good 3-drop? That's a spot where, like, maybe I'm taking a Doomblade and I shouldn't. In that case, it's like I've maybe been burned by the times that I didn't and felt like my deck didn't have enough interaction in it. But anyway, 2 to 4 is the lower number than I would expected, so that's good to know. Curve-wise, how many things do you want? Let's assume we're not talking about green ramp. Like, maybe you have a, Explorer or whatever. We're not talking about a deck that is, like, dedicated to ramping, even though we're talking about green decks. A deck with it, you just have, you're tapping your lands to cast your spells more or less on curve. How many cards do you want at 4 mana value and above on average? And again, ring the bell, the context-dependent bell.
I would say, like, 4 mana and above. 5 would be a lot. Let's say 3 to 5.
I feel like it's about what I tend to aim for too.
Something else I've noticed is my curve might be focused around 2 or 3, like somewhere in there is going to be where I'm going to have the highest density of cards. I think I've noticed that a lot of threats that are in a lot of cubes that I'm playing just really only shine if you already have stuff in play. So it's also that, like, yes, I want some random 1-drops because I want to be putting that early pressure on you to get to that stage of the game where you're no longer able to use your life total flexibly as a resource. But also it's like, I have Gut, I have Broadside Bombardiers, I have something,
Chose some powerful examples there.
Well, I just told you I played some arena-powered cube. And, like, those cards only work if you're already attacking, if you only have stuff that's in play. And I think that is just the case for a lot of 4 and 5 mana spells. Or, like, here, I've got a Rishkar in this random deck I'm looking at. It's like, I really want to maximize that Rishkar and already have creatures in play. Ideally, I want those counters to be having haste.
Okay, I think I have an answer to this question, but let's assume you're green and have a little bit of blue going on. Do you...
Weird choice.
You don't like to play green-blue?
No.
Oh, okay, well, maybe...
I think of all the color pairs, that is the one I'm least likely to play.
I struggle with that color pair in many environments, too, and in some environments where I'm designing the cube, I feel like I have a better foothold because I know exactly what the color pair is intended to do. How much do you like a cantrip in this deck? Let's just say that you can cast blue spells, you're not worried about your mana, and you're like a green curve-out deck, and you get like a Ponder in like a pack where you're comparing that with a like completely forgettable 2 or 3 drop. Like Ponder, obviously, an incredibly powerful card, a very powerful effect in a vacuum or whatever. Like it's just objectively a powerful card. How much do you like that in a deck like this?
I personally value them very low. Like if my goal is to be putting pressure on my opponent, I don't want to be spending any mana not on putting that pressure on. And obviously,
that's how I feel too.
If you put the Ponder in your deck, you're going to find a space to cast it, and it's going to probably improve, like, you're going to have that moment where you have that weird mana inefficiency, and it's going to let you use all your mana, and it's going to help you find your best threats. You're playing it like you're playing the divination
we mentioned earlier. Like,
exactly,
you're not just casting it on curve, you are... Which actually, honestly, I think I want to do an episode about playing with card draw spells, because this is another place where I feel like I have grown a lot, and see players casting cantrips or card draw spells at moments where I'm like, I don't know that I would have done that there, even though you have the mana ostensibly to do it. But anyway, you're saying you're playing that. If you do end up with it in your deck, for whatever reason, even though you're not prioritizing it, you're going to be basically like, well, only when I have to cast it will I. Like, it's not a thing I'm doing early to, like, set up my draws. If I'm going to miss a land drop, I'll cast it. Or if I, have a free mana and it's literally no cost to cast it, I will. But it's not your plan.
Yeah, I mean, even something like Abundant Harvest, which guarantees either land or non-land, is a card I'll play, but is not necessarily something that I am excited about drafting highly or early.
I agree with you, and it was a long road for me to get here. I spent a long time losing with cantrips in my green decks when, I'm a cantrip-pilled gamer and love what they do to an environment in many ways, but I think I agree that I, generally speaking, don't want them in these decks, even though earlier I was complaining about one of the biggest issues being, what if I just draw the wrong half of my deck? The biggest takeaway I have so far from this conversation is that you are, as a baseline, trying to be more proactive than maybe I was expecting to try and be. And so you don't have to worry about drawing on half of your deck. You just want to draw threats and start curving out. And you're starting to curve out a couple turns later than an aggro deck might be or whatever. You're a little bit behind, like, the turn 1 drop, turn 2 more 1-drops start. You're not doing that, but you are planning to basically put threats on board, and that's what your, like, plan for the first 2 to 4 turns of the game is. And then you start, like, assessing things based on the board. When that's your plan, a cantrip doesn't contribute. And I was putting them in decks where it's like, well, I'm not sure what my plan is, and so the cantrip will help me decide. But, like, if you've assessed the fact that you are now the beatdown and you're spending turn 2 to cast a cantrip to find your 2-drop to cast on turn 3, guess what? You may have correctly identified that you're the beatdown, but you're now not able to actually execute that game plan because everything you do is taxed by, the cost of a cantrip.
Not that you couldn't draft a blue-green deck that has that longer-term game plan, but it's harder. Like, there aren't as many green cards that are just like, this is the guaranteed inevitability, and this is the thing that's going to deal with whatever my opponent is doing. A lot of the green threats just shine when you are able to attack with them and keep the pressure on.
One archetype of this deck that I actually feel like I do understand and have success with, and was one of my recent 3-0s from Shoebox, is I actually think of it more as like a grindy control deck almost. I was playing like a Bant, just creatures that enter the battlefield and draw a card, like 2-for-1 deck, right? And there it's like, okay, I know that like my interaction with my opponent, I should have some, again, like we want some interaction in all these decks, but like for their bomb or whatever. But mostly I'm just going to play these creatures, trade off in combat, either because I'm attacking or blocking, and then draw more creatures and play more threats. Like when you can also draw cards and, commit to the board, when you can do both, that's an archetype that I feel like I at least understand. And I'm just building this like kind of inevitability engine where it's like, once I get going, I'm just going to like keep doing stuff and grow, and then like get out of control. That's a version of this deck I feel like I do, when a cube supports it, I feel like I can have success with, is the, Elvish Visionary, Cloudkin Seer, Llanowar Visionary style deck.
I mean, it would make sense to me that that's a deck where you probably do want more removal because your inevitability is through card advantage, but that also means you need ways to deal with the huge threats that are potentially coming.
I don't think I end up with more removal in those decks than you're describing here. I think I want a couple. More, it's like, I know I'm not going to die to aggro. Honestly, I think as a cube designer, a huge level up moment is just realizing how devastating Fibblethip and Elvish Visionary are to most aggro decks. I mean, they're like, it's so unassuming, and you think like, oh, well, who cares? But Baleful Strix or whatever, like all these cards are really, really tough for aggro decks to deal with because they're just cantripping removal spells, essentially. They're cantripping edicts to some degree.
Even if you don't think like, oh, I can't deal with that, you just think, yeah, sure, whatever, I turn my Savannah line sideways, and then you look up and you're like, wait a minute, you still have 4 cards in hand? Right. Like, what am I doing?
You get to the mid-game and you're like, why do I have no cards left? And you have 5. Like, those cards are kind of rough. So anyway, I feel like I'm not going to die to aggro, and then my plan against control is like, well, I guess it's like what I managed to do there is I managed to end up with a threat-dense deck because my threats are already drawing cards, and that's what I like was thinking about. I was like, let's think about getting, ways to churn through my deck. And then how I end up winning is like, well, I just attacked with a couple 2/2s a bunch. And I need to be focusing more on being able to win by attacking with a bunch of 2/2s, whether I have 6 cards in my hand or 2, because that is the part that maybe makes that deck more successful than I'm giving it credit for.
Yeah, I mean, having flexibility in the types of threats that you have obviously also goes a long way to being able to beat different matchups. Like, oh, you're playing against the control deck. You've got, why am I forgetting one of my favorite Magic cards? Creature Land. Doesn't matter, pick anyone.
Celestial Colonnade?
I was thinking of the 3/3.
Treetop Village.
Treetop Village. Like, great. This is a card that's going to... Excellent. I can read the whole text here.
You can hold a Treetop Village card while you're doing it.
Treetop Village is a great card that I love for these kinds of decks where, hey, I'm out of cards. Here's a thing I can do. It's also flexibility against different types of threats. It also gives you this sort of interesting, like, you're spending mana to not add to the board state. You're just dealing damage to your opponent, which I think can create some interesting decisions.
I love creature lands in these decks. That is another space. Maybe I feel like I understand the value of like having 1 or 2 creature lands in your deck is so huge.
Yeah.
It makes you so much less soft to board wipes. It just means that like you can afford to force them to have a board wipe, like actually commit to the board and build things up because you can get a bunch of damage in over a few turns and then just have a Treetop Village waiting in the wings if they do clean everything up. You don't have to like hold back and play around a board wipe because you have nothing to do if you commit to the board and it gets blown up. I also feel like very often you get in a situation where like they just are a land until you've spent all your resources and like dumped all your cards, and then it's just like, well, now I drew a 3/3 every single turn for the rest of the game, and it just costs 2 mana every turn to play my 3/3,
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think mana sinks can be a powerful thing, because maybe you don't have a bunch of card draw spells that are going to keep your hand full, but you can still keep doing stuff. I mean, another point to acknowledge is you're saying, like, well, sometimes I'm just in this situation where I just feel like there was no way to win. I think that's just the reality of Magic. Magic is a very high variance game, and I think you can draft a deck that will just sometimes go 3-0 because you draw the great curve out, and sometimes you won't. And, like, when we're talking about optimizing things, we're talking about very small, meaningful changes to your win percentage by improving your heuristics a little bit.
That's the classic problem of it's hard to see improvement in a game like this because there's so much noise in the actual outcomes, and there's so many other factors that are not just how you approach a draft, but...
It can be hard to see the forest through the Treetop Village.
Yeah. I'm listening. I'm learning.
I think the biggest thing about drafting successful green decks is if you see a Seeka's Chariot, take it. That's what I'm also...
I know that much. I do know that
looking
much.
Through my decks, it's like, oh, this one 3-0'd, and this had a Seeka's Chariot in it. Interesting.
The card is messed up.
It's messed up, and it's so shocking to me that it only has 1 green pip. So I feel like it's also like, why am I playing green? Oh, because I got this like mid-pack too, and I was like, well, I guess I have 1 stomping ground, and I'm just going to figure out how to make it work from here.
Let me summarize my takeaways from this, which I say to those listening, these are specific to me and my proclivities. Maybe you have different hangups around this deck. When drafting a base green, mid-range, whatever you want to call it deck, you are prioritizing comparatively cheap threats. you're probably not curving out with 1-drops most of the time, but you probably have a lot of 2-drops, some 3-drops. You want to be spending the early turns of the game developing a board so that those game pieces can generate value over many future turns, because a creature in your hand does nothing, obviously. A creature in play can attack and block, so the earlier you get them in play, the more value that card has over the course of the game. You are trying to put your opponent on the back foot with your attacks, and therefore force them to either use their life total as a resource, block in inefficient ways, or expose themselves to potentially getting blown out by what we'll call combat tricks, but refer back to my caveat around all the things that are kind of included in that category for the purposes of this conversation. You're only including what I'll call a dash of removal in the average deck. And, obviously, if you have a chance to take a Fury, you take it, even if you already have a bunch of removal spells in your deck. But when you are forced to choose between continuing to build out a curve or taking a removal spell, you're generally prioritizing building out a curve, and you only want removal in as much as you need it. Your removal spell should be used to absolutely deal with a threat you otherwise can't deal with and will lose to on the spot, or basically be there to allow for attacks because you have this removal spell in hand, and you can basically push through attacks with that threat for many turns until your opponent actually forces you to use it by, exposing themselves to blocks.
I think that's a much better summary than I could have given.
We're trying to listen. And when it comes to synergy, again, this is so relative to the cube environment. If you're playing the Turbo Cube or whatever, it's all about synergy. You're not just doing anything fair there. But synergy, it sounds like on average for you, is mostly a side quest. If there's a way I can make a couple cards a little better, fine. But on average, when you're having success with these decks, you are not committing whole hog to some sort of conceit and just turning blinders on and saying, well, I'm taking all the cards that care about +1/+1 counters. That takes a backseat to all these other considerations we just mentioned around curve, a dash of removal, and being able to put pressure on your opponent to make all of your cards a little better.
Maybe another way to phrase that is being a little bit skeptical of the cube designer and not just thinking, if I draft all these cards that say, do blank, they will all work together.
Well, that applies across all the archetypes, I think.
That's definitely true, but just actually evaluating on a case-by-case basis, how much are those synergies affecting the expected value of all of your cards.
Okay.
You ready to go draft green? I know I am.
Well, while you open that letter from a listener from our P.O. box, I will say that we're planning a draft for Tuesday. Well, it's not even a draft. We're planning a funny little experiment where everybody is participating, is building their ideal deck from your regular cube. Just pretend you have access to the whole pool of cards, build a constructed deck where you get, a copy of the regular cube of your own to play with. We're all just going to proxy our decks and then see which one is best. And I'm between a green deck and a not green deck in my sort of final decision-making matrix here. And maybe this is the push I need to try the green deck. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm really curious how this is going to go. I feel like as a cube designer, this is going to be so instructive or maybe destructive to my feelings.
Oh, it's funny.
I immediately had a snap oh yeah, obviously this is the deck I'm building. This is the best deck in the format. And then I'm like, well, but this is also such a different thing. Sure, that's the deck that I think that most often has success in a normal
when you are drafting all your cards.
Now I can get all these. But then it's well, maybe that deck is successful just because there's enough redundancy that you can be confident drafting it in an 8-person pod. And maybe it's
successful because no one else likes it, and so it's always open.
Maybe actually the thing that never comes together because there are only, the 23 cards you need to make this deck.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's the deck, and I feel like I'm just so twisted in my head about what am I doing here? And I'm just going to be so embarrassed.
I'm excited to talk about the results of this experiment either way on the show. What we got in Mailbag there, Anthony?
This is a long letter. I'm going to summarize.
It's a beautiful looking print on that card.
This is a lovely letter from Joey, who feels like they're on a little bit of a losing streak, but they've been...
Hey, same.
But they say they're about to draft green and it's going to go great. No, they didn't say that, but they've been journaling about it and appreciating all of the stuff that isn't winning, all the community and the vibes, and they would also love to be pen pals with Patrick, who wrote in recently through the Lucky Paper P.O. box. So sure, if you want to be pen pals...
Oh, no. Don't say sure. I'm not going to be... I will give you each other's addresses if you want me to. Get me in Discord and give your consent or whatever. But I'm not going to be forwarding physical mail between the P.O. box. I don't have time for that in my life.
Have you ever had a pen pal?
No. If it has to be physical mail, the answer is no. I've never had that.
Also, yeah, very cool card. I wonder if they hand stamp this. Nice.
Thank you for the nice message, Joey. I'm glad that you are focusing on the things that matter, which is to say, not winning. If you want to send a letter to the P.O. Box, it's P.O. Box 4855, Baltimore, Maryland, 21211, and it is the easiest way to get something on the show because we get too many emails, and I do read all of them. I don't respond to almost any of them, so if you sent an email, trust that I read it, and sorry, I didn't respond.
Unless it went to spam. I actually checked my spam folder recently.
There were a bunch of questions in there from whenever I put out a call for questions on the show, I will check the spam folder. So I even got those ones too. And we do still have a giant backlog of questions from the Q&A episode. Thank you, everybody. We recorded enough in advance that I think the last episode requesting questions even went out after we had recorded, so messed that up a little bit. But huge backlog of questions for us to answer, so thank you, everybody, for that. And more Q&A episodes coming soon, I think. At the time of recording this one, episode 300 hasn't even come out yet. Maybe everyone will hate the Q&As. I'm not sure. I think they'll like them. On that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. All the music for this show is produced by DJ James Nasty, and the show is edited by Matthew. This podcast is produced by Thinking About Magic Cards and Speaking to Microphones About It. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Thank you for talking about my favorite color in Magic.
Much like people complain to you when a cube feels like it hasn't been shuffled accurately because of the broadcast shuffle, can I now complain to you every time I lose with green ever again?
Sure. Yeah, I don't think you needed my permission to complain.
But now I have it.